To start off, we're going to be talking about one of the most infamous cases of terrible base stats, Onyx. This one's a bit of an exception since I know that Onyx did get a buff in the form of Steelix, but in every Kanto game, which there are a lot of, you're stuck with just Onyx. So I think it's fair game to make it better than the miserable mess it is right now. Also, Steelix is a trait evolution, so not everybody can get it. So let's make Onyx something worth keeping in its base form too. Looking at its gag-inducing stat distribution, we can see that there's one stat that is much higher than the rest, being its physical defense at an astonishing 160. Problem is, it fails at being a physical tank at all because there's an easy counter. Just use a special move. Rock Ground is a pretty bad typing, and it's made even worse for Onyx since it only has a base 45 special defense, and 3 of its 5 weaknesses are special, so it's getting one-shot most of the time. This leads to its second problem. In Kanto, the first place you can catch an Onyx is in Rock Tunnel, 3 badges into the game. By that point, you've already gotten access to much better rock or ground type Pokemon, and as such, Onyx ends up being a Pokemon that you have absolutely zero reason to use. So let's see how we can reasonably make it good. First off, the obvious fix: improve Onyx's overall base stats. The first thing I do is to increase its HP to 60 for a little more bulk, since 35 is just awful. Secondly, and most obvious, increase its physical attack stat. I decided on 90, which seems strange given that it's higher than Steelix's, but it works well with the next change, which is to raise its speed. For a Pokemon that can rapidly bore through the ground, I think it should have a base 100 speed stat. This will allow it to get critical hits more frequently in Gen 1, as well as just let it get in a hit before fainting. I would also lower its defense all the way down to 100 since I'm making it more of a glass cannon. As for moves, in the Gen 3 games, giving it Earthquake and Explosion by level up would be nice, and in more recent games, Onyx could even get more attack coverage with the Elemental Fangs, Crunch, and Heavy Slam, as well as Coil to boost its attack and accuracy, which I think makes sense given that it's shaped like a snake. And I mean, there are like 0 rock-type moves with 100% accuracy. Lastly, for abilities, 2 that I think would work are Sandstream, since it pairs well with its rock typing, and No Guard, which seems a bit strange at first glance, but a few dex entries state that Onyx has an internal magnet to never lose direction, so being able to always attack and never miss could give it a small niche over other rock types. These changes would actually give players a reason to use Onyx over Steelix, kinda like Scyther and Scizor. You could choose between being speedy at the cost of some defense, or focus purely on defense while losing speed. When it comes to the Pokemon least used by anybody in a Kanto playthrough, there are a lot of strong contenders such as Ditto and Onyx, but I feel like those are infamous for being terrible. This next Pokemon is one that I have hardly ever seen anybody use due to it being both incredibly mediocre and not obtained until later on. I'm talking about Seeking, probably one of the most unimpressive Pokemon both battle-wise and design-wise. I mean, seriously, I wonder how many people's favorite Pokemon is actually Seeking. This thing is hilariously bad, especially when pit against the myriad of far superior water types. So let's try to make it somewhat stand out, because right now this fish is just going to be stuck in its tank. Firstly, besides a decent attack stat, it has nothing else going for it. I'm honestly a bit stuck as to what I'd even do, given that it's literally just a goldfish, but I guess based on its dex entries and physical appearance, I'd raise its attack to 110, its defense to 80, and its special defense to 90. I don't really think making it faster would really fit it, seeing as it's a pretty chunky looking goldfish, so I think extra bulk would be nice. Now for its level up moves, in the Gen 3 games, I'd give it Water Pulse as an early level up move since Golding doesn't get any stab until Waterfall, which I find to be weird. For coverage moves, I'd give it Revenge since Seeking tend to be feisty, Stockpile, Swallow, and Spit Up to reference its behavior during mating season, Drill Peck since it already learns Peck, and it would be an easy way to counter grass types, and you know what? Why not Dragon Dance for some flavor? In more recent games, it could also get Liquidation, Close Combat, Iron Head, Drill Run, and as a more controversial pick, Wild Charge. I actually think an electric move sort of fits given that it has Lightning Rod as an ability, so you could probably make the argument that Seeking can store the electricity for an all-out attack. And of course, as a final change, in the Kanto games, I'd probably make Goldeen available a lot earlier, since you can't get this thing until after you've completed the Pokemon Tower quest, which makes no sense given how underwhelming it is. The deck states that Seeking are aggressive fighters and strong swimmers, and I think these changes can allow Seeking to demonstrate that, unlike the puny, forgotten fish that we have right now. It's time to talk about Seviper's older cousin, Arbok, who is, well, underwhelming in pretty much every aspect. Just like Seeking, every single stat is mediocre besides its attack, which is still just decent. It suffers due to not being fast, not hitting hard, and not being tanky. It's just kind of there. What Arbok needs is something to make it stand out against the many Kanto poison types. So believe it or not, I'm actually not going to make it any faster like I did with Seviper. I think a lot of its level up moves make him more fitting as a bulkier physical attacker rather than the fast sweeper that I made Seviper. Obviously, with its current stats, it can't do that. So I'd raise both of its defensive stats to around 95, its HP to 70, and I would lower its speed to 60. It's not a complete monster, but given that Ekans evolves at just level 22, I think it's good enough. Speaking of it being a monster, let's give it some more creepy changes. Its dex entries state that it uses the frightening pattern on its belly to intimidate and stun foes, so I don't see why Arbok didn't get an extra dark typing in Gen 2. It has enough evil attributes, and it would also give it a really unique niche of being a dark type in Kanto, allowing it to destroy the many rampant psychic types. As for level up moves, in the Gen 3 remakes, I think it'll still have a hard time with coverage due to its low special attack, but some moves I'd give it are Poison Tail and Fang for better mid-game moves than Acid, and then Sludge Bomb later. Curse to boost its stats and to make it bulkier, Pursuit since the deck states that it never gives up hunting prey, and Revenge to complement it being slow and bulky. In the newer games, it could get Sucker Punch to showcase a snake's fast-striking behavior, and Aqua Tail for ground-type coverage. With these changes, Arbok could actually be the intimidating, powerful threat the dex makes it out to be, rather than the underwhelming sideliner it is. I gotta admit, I really love Hypno's design. It's so simple, yet subtly ominous, especially when paired with its dex entries. But sadly, Game Freak didn't pour as much love into its usability in battle. It's sort of in the same position as Arbok and Seeking, where most of its stats are mediocre and nothing else. Its special defense is great, but that's really it. It's unfortunate since I think Hypno had a lot of potential to be unique, especially as a psychic type. My first change is pretty obvious. Give it an extra dark typing. The Gen 1 dex has 0 dark types, excluding regional forms, so just like Arbok, not only is it fitting due to its sinister nature, but it gives Hypno a nice niche of being a psychic type that can beat its peers. As for its stats, I'd lower its speed to 50, increase its special attack by 10, and increase its physical defense by 20. It still won't hit super hard, but I think being bulkier leans into its slow, creepy behavior. As for level up moves, there are quite a lot of missed opportunities here. In the Gen 3 games, for psychic moves, it could get Extra Sensory and Dream Eater to play into its ability to use hypnotic powers, Calm Mind for general boosting, then Pursuit, Feint Attack, Will-O-Wisp, and Curse for more evil attacks. However, in the newer games, it could get Drain Punch for coverage and healing, Stored Power if you want to set up, Payback as a better dark move, Hex if you want to rely on putting the enemy to sleep, and if you really want to play into Hypno's manipulative traits, Power Swap, Power Trick, and Gravity, which I think will play well with the ability changes I'm going to give it, being Shadow Tag and Prankster. Shadow Tag is pretty obvious, as Hypno could probably hypnotize the opponent into not being able to flee, and Prankster is so that it can use status moves first. I think these changes immensely help Hypno by not only bringing out its sinister reputation, but also making it interesting to use in battle. When it comes to the worst bug-type Pokemon to ever exist, most would probably say something like Kricketune, Wormadam, or Ladian. But I think a lot of people forget just how unforgivably bad Parasect is. And just like Ledian, it really sucks because Parasect's concept is really cool, a bug that was overtaken by its mushroom. Unfortunately, despite its cool lore, it's completely useless in battle, and I can say that from using it several times in Kanto Challenge playthroughs. It's slow, can't hit hard, and ironically, dies easily, so this thing is gonna need a huge makeover. Firstly, its typing. Bug Grass is just awful. In fact, in the original Generation 1 games, it holds the trophy for having the most 4 times weaknesses of any Pokemon ever, with 3, since Poison was also super effective against Bug. Seeing how Parasect is a zombified bug shell, it's a no-brainer to give it a part Ghost type. I've seen this change proposed a lot around the internet, and not only does it make biological sense, but it also adds another Ghost type in Kanto, which it seriously needs. But now we have to choose whether we want it to be a bug ghost type or a grass ghost type. On one hand, there are other mushroom Pokemon with the grass type. On the other hand, while the mushroom does all of the thinking, its Ultra Sun Dex entry states that the bug is mostly dead, not completely dead. And if Shedinja, a lifeless husk, is still considered a bug, I think Parasect could still be considered a bug type as well. Now for its stats, I have no problem with it being slow. It's a zombified cicada, but I think its attack could be raised to around 120 and its physical defense raised to 100. For new level up moves, Parasect luckily gets some nice treats. In the Gen 3 games, it could get Fury Cutter and Shadow Ball as its best stab moves, and to play into its undead design more, it could also get Nightmare, Leech Seed, and Dream Eater, which will synergize well with Spore. And for some coverage, it could get Metal Claw in the early game and Revenge to complement its low speed. In newer games, along with its current moves, it could get Drain Punch as a reference to it sucking the life out of plants, Payback, Infestation, and as a controversial pick, I'd even give it the 3 order moves exclusive to Vespiquen. Parasect's whole design is based around its body being taken over by the mushroom on its back, so I think that the mushroom being able to command the body like a vehicle or machine could work. The only problem I see with it is that the move animation for the order attacks shows bees, so maybe it could be reworked, or there could be custom parasite-themed moves. Either way, Parasect will finally be able to spread its legs instead of being sent in and then knocked out the very next turn, never to be looked at again. But finally, we have one of the most forgotten yet most overshadowed Pokemon in existence, especially for Gen 1, Dugong. I mean, just look at it. It's just a white seal with the small horn. And to make matters worse, you can't find one until towards the very end of the game in the Seafoam Islands. And even once you catch it, these are the stats you're rewarded with. But to put the final nail in the coffin, you genuinely have zero reason to use it because it's been outclassed by several other Pokemon since day one. Want a hard hitter? Use Cloyster. Want a bulky water type? Use Lapras, who by the way is also obtainable earlier. Well, it at least has thick fat, right? Yeah, Game Freak also gave that to another water ice type, Walrein, who is just far better in every way and is also a pinniped. It's almost like it was a direct replacement for Dugong. Much like how Magcargo in my previous video seemed unfixable, Dugong also seems to be in a similar boat. In fact, I'd argue that it's in an even worse situation because of how many water types there are. I don't think there's anything you could do to Dugong itself besides an evolution or something really drastic, but here are some changes that I think will help it make it slightly more desired. Firstly, Dugong needs some more bulk. Based on it having thick fat and hydration as its 2 abilities, it's clearly meant to be defensive. So I'd give it 10 more HP, 10 more special defense, 10 more defense, and 20 more physical attack. Yeah, it's a pretty big buff, but what it currently has needs some dire changes. Speaking of which, its next big problem, lack of move coverage. Even in newer games, it's incredibly limited with what types it can cover. Most of that is probably due to its bland design, but I still feel like there are some level of moves it could get that make sense. Firstly, in the Gen 3 games, it can get Mega Horn instead of Signal Beam to showcase its horn being used in battle. For some coverage, it could get Crunch since it has sharp tusks, and I don't think Earthquake would be too much of a stretch since it's a pretty hefty looking Pokemon. And to further display its blubbery body and habit of resting a lot, it could also get Belly Drum for extra power and then Slack Off and Pain Split as means of recovery. In newer games, it can even get more coverage based on its design like Zen Headbutt, Drill Run, Horn Leech, and Body Press. Lastly, while I think Thick Fat is a great ability, I think giving it a custom ability to showcase its fondness of ice and swimming would really give it something unique. The deck states that it becomes more energetic in colder weather and it's water ice, so Dugong could get a new ability, which I'll call Frigid Frenzy, where its speed and attack are raised by 50% during rain or hail, but it also loses some of its HP every turn, as a result of it becoming hyperactive. Let's start things off with a starter, more specifically, poor old Meganium. While its stats aren't bad, it really struggles in Johto due to its worse move pool and really unfavorable matchups. If you chose Chikorita at the start of your journey, you were in for a rough time. Meganium has a grand total of 0 good matchups against any of the gym leaders or Elite Four. It's really only good against Chuck's Poliwrath and Price's team, although he can also deal big damage to you. Yeah, that's it. And that's not even mentioning how common poison types are due to the insane amount of Team Rocket grunts you have to face. So it's really hard to make a grass type Pokemon good in Johto, but let's see what we can do. The first change is going to be controversial and many of you might not agree, but I think giving Meganium an extra ground type would really help it out. It's based off of a sauropod, which were some of the largest land-dwelling animals to ever exist, so I think it being tied to earthy traits would be nice. And it would also allow it to have a way to beat the endless amounts of coughing and Grimer in the Gen 2 games. Now, as for moves, here's where a gentle giant needs to become not so gentle. Based on its stat distribution, it's pretty clear that Meganium is supposed to be a bulky support Pokemon that can still dish out decent damage if it needs to. However, there's a lot of missed potential here in both the status and attack departments. Looking at Chikorita's Heart Gold and Soul Silver level up move list, we can see that it learns Razor Leaf at level 6, which is pretty good for the early game, but it doesn't get any big upgrades until level 32 in Petal Dance. Don't get me wrong, 90 base power is good, but having to be logged into using it and getting confused after is a steep drawback. That's why I think it would be nice to give it a better intermediate stab move than Magical Leaf, like Giga Drain. It's only 60 power in Gen 4, but being able to attack and gain HP is something I feel like a lot of grass starters strangely lack, and it also complements its bulk. For status moves, Poison Powder and Synthesis are a nice start, but for some reason, Meganium just kind of stops learning anymore. I think we can take a lesson or two from Venusaur and slap Leech Seed and Sleep Powder on it. I mean, those flowers need to serve some purpose, right? And finally, we need to address its coverage. It has basically zero coverage by level up. However, it's got some interesting tutor moves that I think should and can biologically fit into Meganium's level up move list. First off, Ancient Power, since it's based off of an extinct animal. Outrage, since I feel like Meganium can be dangerously powerful if it feels threatened. And lastly, why not slap Earth Power on it for some beautiful ground stab, or just Earthquake in Gen 2. I think with these moveset tweaks, Meganium can actually be a formidable choice for a Johto playthrough. So this one's a bit interesting. I think in the remakes, Noctowl sort of got buffed due to its moveset actually becoming decent. However, in the Gen 2 games, it's completely useless in battle. Even with its moveset buff though, I feel like Noctowl still just doesn't have enough going for it to justify using it in a playthrough, especially when you have much better flying type options. What Noctowl needs is to actually become the silent killer of the night that its dex entries hype it up to be. Apparently, it never fails at catching prey in darkness, but I'm not sure how we can do that with such pitiful offensive stats. Its bulky distribution completely contradicts its design and dex entries. I think boosting its special attack to around 100 will patch up its inability to deal damage. I've seen people say that it should be Ghost Flying, and that would be really cool seeing how there's only one new Ghost in Gen 2, but I don't really think Noctowl quite fits the typing enough. And the other two typings that could fit, Dark and Psychic, are already taken by more fitting birds. So I think Noctowl should stay as just kind of an honorary Ghost type, learning a lot of supernatural moves by level up. But this is where the differences between Gen 2 and Gen 4 really show. You see, without a physical special split, Noctowl's Ghost attacks would be running off of its terrible physical attack. So here's where the movesets will kind of diverge. For level up moves in the Gen 2 games, I'd give it Wing Attack so that it has a better move than Peck, and then Feint Attack and Pursuit to showcase its nocturnal hunting behavior, Psychic since it already learns a lot of Psychic type moves, Icy Wind for coverage against Lance, Haste for utility, and to complement its bulk, Moonlight. For the Gen 4 games, for stab, Gust would be better instead of Peck, and Hyper Voice would be a cool normal special attack, and then throughout your adventure, it'll get access to more elemental moves like Ominous Wind, Shadow Ball, Heat Wave, and Will-O-Wisp. Giving Noctowl more moves to showcase its nocturnal characteristics would not only make it more viable in battle, but also give it something unique compared to the other regional birds. Because right now, Noctowl is probably one of the least sought after. And yet again, it's time for another case of an awesomely designed Pokemon suffering from Johto syndrome, and this time it's going to be at the bottom of the ocean. Lantern is probably one of my favorite Pokemon. Unique typing, cute design, cool ability, what's not to love, right? Well, I can tell you right now, its stats. Oh man, they're bad. We have surprisingly great HP, but then everything else is mediocre at best. Now, I actually don't have too big of a problem with its distribution in particular, as it being a bulky, slow special attacker makes sense. But for a mid to late game Pokemon that you kind of have to go out of your way to obtain, the novelty of its typing wears off pretty fast. I'd honestly lower its HP to somewhere around 100 and then boost its special attack by 10 and its special defense by 15. Because, let's be honest, Lantern does not need that much HP. In Gen 2, again, with the physical special split, I'd give it slightly different moves. Feint Attack would be a pretty cool coverage move for Psychic and Ghost types, and it makes sense given Lantern's stealthy behavior. Its association with Light and Rays, as well as access to Signal Beam in the remakes, would make Psybeam and Aurora Beam somewhat realistic options, and would also give it coverage against the many Grass Poison types throughout the main game. For the remakes, along with the previous moves, I think we could get more coverage with Flash Cannon, but more controversially, even Tail Glow. I know that Lantern's light isn't exactly on its tail, but the move description never actually states that the light has to come from the user's tail, and with Lantern's main trait of lighting up the ocean, I think it would very well improve its performance in battle. Maybe with these buffs, Lantern will be able to dazzle more players into using it more, as it's way too overlooked right now. Ah, poor little Sunkern. For almost 20 years, it was stuck at the bottom of the barrel, just a Pokemon to be looked at once in shock due to its pitiful stats, and then never again. But for the few very patient saints who decided to raise this helpless seed, they were rewarded with one of the worst fully evolved Pokemon. Yeah, let's face it, Sunflora sucks. Its special attack stat is actually good, but everything else, especially its speed, is not. Interestingly, in the Gold and Silver beta, it was actually supposed to be a first form Grass Psychic type that would evolve later on, but unfortunately, for some unknown reason, any trace of decency was thrown out the window upon full release, which is really a shame, so let's fix this incredibly creatively designed Pokemon. Speaking of which, one of Sunflora's biggest problems is its plainness. Being a slow, pure grass type Pokemon doesn't help it stand out from the rest, so why not do it a big favor and make it Grass Fire? Yeah, it's a bit cliche given that it's a sunflower, but let's be honest, Gen 2 needs more fire types, besides 2 post-game exclusive ones. This would also allow it to destroy Price and especially Jasmine, whose Steelix can be pretty annoying if you're not prepared. It would also pair wonderfully with its ability, Chlorophyll, giving it a speed boost and boosting its fire type attacks. As for its stats, all I'd really do is increase its special defense to 95 and speed to 50, which will make it slightly more usable in battle. But now time for its moves, and there are quite a few toys I'm going to be giving it. Firstly, it needs some fire attacks obviously, so I'd give it Heat Wave by Level Up and Flamethrower, Fire Blast, and Overheat by TM. I'm also going to give it Earth Power as it's a move tutor move, and it also helps it out against some of its common counters. For quick healing, it would get Morning Sun, seeing as it's active during the day, and this would also allow it to heal most of its health once it sets up the sun. I would also give it a couple of cleric-like moves that tie into Sunflora being a sunflower, such as Aromatherapy due to flowers generally being associated with having a good scent, and Calm Mind since sunflowers are associated with positive spiritual energy. I definitely think these changes emphasize Sunflora's sunflower design, but also getting the buffs that it needs so that it can finally get the attention it's been craving for over 2 decades. Say hello to one of the worst fully evolved Pokemon in history, Ladian. This is probably the most unfortunate of them, seeing how much potential it had. It's a ladybug mixed with an alien that learns a lot of punching moves, yet has completely garbage offensive stats, even for an early game bug type. The only stat that stands out is its strangely high special defense, which doesn't help given that it's a bug flying type. A terrible defensive combo. If Ladian ever wants to see any chance at being a team member, it's going to need a massive rework. So the first step to fixing this broken mess is to give it a major stat redistribution that actually makes sense. I'd lower its special defense all the way down to 60 and boost its physical attack to 95, its speed to 100, and its special attack to 80. And I know some of you are probably wondering about Ariados, and to be honest, while it also sucks, I think that its stat distribution makes sense, so I'd probably just buff its defensive stats a bit more, seeing as it's meant to be a disruptor. As for its moveset, in Gen 2, we get 2 of the elemental punches by TM, but I would actually go a step further and give it all 3 punches as late level up moves. Given its association with the stars and aliens, I think adding Moonlight, Calm Mind, Cosmic Power, and Extrasensory would all also work as new coverage moves. And lastly, I'd give it U-Turn and Drain Punch as level up moves instead of being locked to TMs for some better stab. And as for abilities, Ladian needs both of them changed, as neither are really useful at all. I'd replace them with Technician and Iron Fist, which lean into Ladian's many low power moves, as well as its plethora of punching attacks. But to top it all off, since Ladian learns so many fighting-based moves, why not give it a part fighting type instead of flying? Yes, I know that Heracross does exist, but Ladybug is much easier to obtain, and Gen 2 is severely lacking in fighting types, so this would further convince players to spend time raising what is currently a waste of a Pokemon. But to end things off, let's talk about one of the most forgotten and terrible fully evolved Pokemon to ever exist, Magcargo. It's the Gen 2 Pokemon, only notorious because nobody remembers it's from Gen 2. But why is that? Well, for some reason, Game Freak thought that it was a genius idea to lock some Johto Pokemon in the post-game, including Magcargo. This was sort of remedied in the remakes with the addition of the Slugma egg, but even then, it's still one of the worst fire types to exist, being stuck at about the same base stat total as third stage bug types. That's really embarrassing for a post-game only Pokemon, but not only are its stats pitifully low, but the distribution in particular is awful for a fire rock type. 30 base speed means that you're almost always going to be going second, and 120 defense is less helpful than you think with a 4 times weakness to ground. It's pretty much the worst combination of stats with one of the worst type combinations. So is there any way to remotely salvage this Pokemon? Well, the first change I'd make is pretty obvious. Make Slugma available earlier. I think Union Cave works as a good early game location since the cave is home to multiple fire breathers and Magcargo is part rock, so I think Slugma living in a rocky cave works. At least, it works a whole lot better than randomly being on Cycling Road. Plus, it's a nice way to counter the upcoming bug gym. But even then, I've come to the unfortunate conclusion that Magcargo itself is simply unfixable in its original generation. Being Fire Rock is just abysmal no matter what realistic buffs I give it. Increase its special attack? It's still gonna die to ground and water types. Increase its speed? That doesn't make sense on a Fire Rock snail. So for any further fixes, we'll need to look at the remakes, because what I think Magcargo needs is a major ability change. Flame Body isn't bad, but it's not all that helpful alone, and Magma Armor is completely useless in battle since it's a fire type. This is going to be a drastic change, but Magcargo needs a way to deal with water types, and what better way than to make it straight up immune to them? Its text entry states that water immediately vaporizes upon contact, so why doesn't that happen in battle? Unfortunately, in Gen 4, the only ability that does this is Water Absorb, which doesn't fit its design. So for the first time ever, I'm gonna have to give it a custom ability, which I'll name Corona. It'll be sort of a combination of Water Absorb and Flame Body, making Magcargo completely immune to water attacks, while also having a 30% chance to burn the opponent when hit by a contact move. This pairs well with its high defense stat, but also shields it from being knocked out instantly by a water attack. As for some quick final touches, I think its Gen 7 buff is a step in the right direction, but maybe increase its HP and defense by another 10 points for good measure. And finally, for level up moves, Power Gem for special stab, Charge Beam since Magcargo can probably generate a ton of power due to its heat, and also to possibly get a special attack boost, and finally Explosion just in case if it's in a pinch. If I were to ask you what fully evolved Pokemon has the lowest base stat total besides Shedinja, what would you say? Most would probably say Kricketune, and you're correct. But if I were to ask you this exact question 8 years ago, you'd actually be wrong. That's because that spot used to be held by Delcatty with a mere 380 base stat total. It did get an extra 20 speed in Gen 7, making it have a 90 base speed, but that isn't really helping it in any way as every other stat is mediocre at best. What makes its abysmal stats even stranger is that Skitty, its pre-evolution, is incredibly rare in the Gen 3 games, only being found in one route and very rarely at that. And to top it all off, it evolves using a Moonstone. And where's the first place you can get a Moonstone? Meteor Falls. So you're stuck with an even worse Pokemon for almost half the game. Now, all is not terrible. The Skitty line has 2 things that make it special. Firstly, contests. Yeah, remember those? One of the many experimental features introduced in Gen 3 that a grand total of 5 people ended up seriously using. Delcatty is actually a really good contest Pokemon, but this is about improving underwhelming Pokemon in battle, and unfortunately, its only unique thing in that field is being the only Pokemon to know Assist in Gen 3, which is a move that randomly picks any move from your team. So it's pretty clear that Delcatty isn't meant to be an offensive beast. Its Pokédex entry literally states that it dislikes fighting, so turning it into a sweeper would be inappropriate. I think that increasing its speed in Gen 7 was the right call, but we could definitely bump it up further to around 110 to 115. Other cat Pokemon like Persian and, Perugly of all things, have relatively high speed stats, so why not Delcatty as well? I'd also make it meatier on the HP side and slightly bulkier defensively. Like, seriously, those defensive stats are just awful, especially for a Pokemon that has a lot of support potential. I also think that its encounter rate should be significantly increased so that people can actually find one. A couple of moves that I would add to its level up move list are Baton Pass for obvious reasons, Encore to trap opposing Pokemon, and Memento, because a Memento is a keepsake, and I mean also, the fluffy tail is literally based off of a Skitty's tail. Finally, for the Gen 3 remakes, I'd also give it an extra fairy type because, you know what, we might as well make every single pink thing part fairy, and I mean it would also make it a lot better in battle. I think these changes enhance the supportive / assist role that Delcatty could have filled in while not giving crazy unrealistic changes. Quick question, did anyone else used to think that this thing was bug water for the longest time? Surskit is, but strangely, Masquerain becomes a boring bug flying type. I don't know, maybe it's just some kind of like personal Mandela effect? Anyway, this thing really got the short end of the stick, just like a lot of other Gen 3 Pokemon. Surskit is yet another that was made unnecessarily rare, but isn't really great. It's only found in a couple of routes in Ruby and Sapphire with a 1% encounter rate, and only in Swarms in Emerald. At its introduction, this was Masquerain's stat distribution. It did end up getting a pretty big buff in Gen 7, but I still don't think it's worth using. It's in a similar position as Delcatty, but nowhere near as dire and has potential to be a threat, so let's see what we can improve starting in the stats department. Even with the biggest stat buff in Pokemon history, Masquerain still isn't a great Pokemon. Looking at both its pre and post buff stat distribution, it's clear that Masquerain is meant to be specially oriented. However, I think its special attack stat is just fine. What this forgotten bug really needs is a defense and speed boost. Its moth-like appearance and dex entry stating that it can fly like a helicopter is really misleading given its mediocre 80 speed and almost criminal 60 speed before Gen 7. So why don't we bump it up a notch to around 120? And it wouldn't hurt to give it some much needed special defense points while we're at it. With a higher special defense stat, Masquerain can tank electric attacks better and also counter physical attacks with Intimidate. For its moveset, oh god. We get a grand total of 1 water, bug, and flying type move each. In all honesty, I could probably make an entire video talking about how bad the old Pokemon movesets were. Unfortunately, because of the physical special split, Masquerain will still suffer in the original games. I'd give it Water Pulse as a level up move to replace Water Sport since it lives near ponds, and also because Water Sport is just useless. Signal Beam since it needs a better bug move than Silver Wind, and Giga Drain for extra coverage, Mud Shot since I'd imagine wet places to be pretty muddy and also for ground type coverage. And finally Glare instead of Sunspore so Masquerain can consistently paralyze Pokemon, which fits its theme of being intimidating to look at. Lastly, one major change I'd give it is to change its typing from Bug Flying to Bug Water. I know that Araquanid exists now, but it's got a completely different role, so I think it's fine. And plus, it's a much better typing that still suits it. And now we have 2 Gen 3 Pokemon that have become forgotten due to being unusually rare and not good. Wow, what a surprise, right? Seriously, what was Game Freak thinking when coming up with the stats for these Pokemon? I put these 2 Pokemon together since they're clearly counterparts to each other and have pretty similar stats with a few differences. Unfortunately, these balanced stats are just mediocre all around. It makes one wonder why they're only found in 1 route in their debut region. Of course, only being found well after the second gym. At least in Gen 2, there was Heracross, which was cryptically rare but strong. Here, we have 2 Pokemon that don't even have a stat above 90. To start things off, why not literally light up the Hoendex a bit and give these 2 boring Fireflies the electric type? Gen 3 has only the Manectric line, Bustle, and Minun for new electric types, so spreading the love is much appreciated. Now, as for stats, here is where I think the two get very different treatments. Volbeat should have a much higher special attack stat than physical attack since it's the one with Tail Glow, so it's kinda pointless having it with a base 47 special attack. As for Illumise, its support-oriented move list in Gen 3 makes me feel like it should have a bulkier distribution instead. It would also be kinda cool to see Cosmic Power on it since it's kinda fitting due to it already having Moonlight, or at least some good stat boosting move like Quiver Dance in newer games to take advantage of its ability to Baton Pass. As for general level up moves, adding Charge Beam and Volt Switch to both could give them some nice potential, and in the original Gen 3 games, maybe something like Spark and Signal Beam to both. You're probably scratching your head right now since I literally just covered two counterparts, so why am I only mentioning Seviper and not Zangoose? Well, I think Zangoose's stat distribution is fine as is, so the only thing that I think could be improved is just making its stats higher. Seviper, on the other hand, is, yeah. Talk about wasted potential. It's pretty neat having equally good offensive stats and a surprisingly great move pool, but that doesn't matter when you can't outspeed or take a hit. Unfortunately, Seviper suffers from being a late game Pokemon that doesn't offer enough to be wanted, which, as you'll see, is going to be a trend for the rest of this video. So stat-wise, I feel Seviper can easily be fixed with one simple change, making it faster. Seriously, why does it feel like so many Gen 3 Pokemon are unnecessarily slow? Seviper could function as a fantastic sweeper in the Hoenn games with a speed stat of just 100 or higher, plus the poison type was seriously lacking until Gen 6. As for new potential moves, I would give it Sword Stance to allow it to potentially sweep, Sludge Bomb because it seems like Game Freak just forgot to give it to any poison types, Giga Drain because Leech Life sucks in Gen 3, and maybe Dig for some steel coverage before you get Flamethrower? I don't know. And for a second ability, having Intimidate or Poison Point would also be nice. What I do know though is that these changes will go a long way into making Seviper a desirable choice on one's team. I know I said I wasn't going to talk about gimmick Pokemon since most of them were designed to be weak and just for collecting, but Castform is an exception since its gimmick revolves around battling. On paper, it seems cool. A Pokemon that can change its type based on the weather? Why wouldn't you want to use that? Well, when you look at its stats, you can kinda see why it's been forgotten. 70 in every stat means that it can't do anything well. I'm assuming that Game Freak might have thought that making it good would be too powerful, but 70 is just too weak. Now, this one's kind of fun. An interesting way to make Castform a more fun and memorable Pokemon to use would be to make each of its forms have a unique stat distribution. In its base form, I think that it having a base stat total of 420 is fine, maybe make it a little more skewed towards speed, but its forms should all have a total of 480 instead. Its rain form should be slower and bulkier, its hail form should be a glass cannon, and its sunny form could be more mixed. Lastly, the only thing I changed with its moveset is to give it Recover due to water's cleansing properties, and Castform is based off of a water molecule. This would incentivize having weather moves on your team and also make Castform a worthy Pokemon to use in a playthrough. You know what? I take back saying that Seviper was wasted potential because here we have one of the most disappointing Pokemon of all time. It has all of the ingredients to make an underwhelming Pokemon. Late game, rare, disappointing stats, and a disappointing move pool. By the time you can catch a Tropius, there are already far better grass and flying types, so most people opt to just make it an HM user since it can learn 5 of them. Stat-wise, Tropius is very balanced, but not in a good way. Its health and speed are the standouts, with more health and a lot less speed. However, every other stat is just average. I think that both of its defensive stats should be around 100 and its special attack should be buffed to around 85. Now, I know 85 isn't really all that high, but this will stay faithful to its bulky distribution and design, but also give it some much needed strength, seeing as its move list is largely composed of attacking moves. Speaking of which, let's fix up this level up move list, which is abysmal. Its only flying type move is Gust, which just makes no sense. So So let's replace Whirlwind with Air Cutter for a decent upgrade over Gust, and then maybe if you want later you can replace it with Fly. Tropius would also love getting Leech Seed by level up since, I mean, it has fruits on its neck, so it being able to create seeds isn't too out there, and this would complement its high HP. If you want to be a little riskier, Curse could also be learned by level up since he'll probably be going slower in the first place. Finally, for some coverage, I'd let it learn Rock Tomb and Rock Slide by TM to cover its ice and fire weaknesses, and lastly, Outrage. This one's going to be pretty controversial, but I think it works. Tropius is based off of a sauropod, so while it prefers not to fight if threatened, I can absolutely see Tropius going berserk. It could probably be its last level up move. With these new moves and stat changes, I feel like Tropius could finally get the love it's been craving for over 20 years. It doesn't have to have the world's highest stats, but what it has right now is almost a crime. And finally, we have a Pokemon that I genuinely feel has absolutely no purpose to exist outside of its introduction, and I'm talking about the poor little wind chime. If you've never used a Chimecho on your team before, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. In fact, I'd say that you're doing yourself a favor since this thing can't do anything better than any other psychic type in Hoenn besides, well, being cute. Take a look at its stats. Yeah, they're not horrible, but in a game where you can use Alakazam, Metagross, and Gardevoir, why would you want to use it? And by the way, these are the post-buff stats. This is what it used to have. So in Gen 3, it's on the same level as Pokemon such as Linoone and Mightyena. The difference is that those are found at the very beginning of the game. Whoa, where is Chimecho found, you may be asking? Well, I'll tell you, on the top of Mount Pyre, with a 1% chance of being found. And to top it all off, it got a baby form the next generation. Imagine if something like Farfetch got a pre-evolution instead of an evolution in Gen 8. That's how ridiculous that is. You're better off using Grumpig instead, and that's saying a lot. I genuinely don't think anything can realistically be done to Chimecho itself to make it a top tier Pokemon. It would probably need a whole new evolution, and possibly even more, but here are some small fixes that I think could at least make it the tiniest bit appealing in the Gen 3 games. First of all, Chimecho needs a lot more speed to make it stand out. I think somewhere around 95 would give it somewhat of an edge since it could then outspeed Gardevoir, Grumpig, and Metagross. Now, my second change is kind of reaching, but I'd make Chimecho part Steel type. Steel Psychic is a great typing due to its many resistances, and this pairs well with its many support moves. However, if you wanted to use it offensively, you still could, as it could strike first and hit decently hard. It would basically become a Metagross that you could use earlier, since Beldum can't be obtained until post-game. Unfortunately, there aren't any good steel moves in Gen 3 that suit its design besides maybe Iron Defense and Metal Sound, but steel attacks don't really matter with its poor physical attack. By level up, the only things I'd replace are Psywave with extra sensory, since Psywave is a completely useless move, and I mean it gets it in future generations, so I don't see why I can't get it here. And then Takedown with Cosmic Power, since the Wind Chime it's based on is used to ward off evil, so being able to tap into supernatural powers isn't too out of the question. But sadly, that's it. There's not much else I feel can be done that makes sense. I mean, maybe in later generations it could get Rattled as a second ability to help cover its Dark and Ghost weaknesses from Gen 6 onward, but either way, will these major changes be enough to convince players to want to use a late game, easily skippable, incredibly overshadowed Pokemon that's been lost in time? Well, I don't know, and sadly, since these are just hypothetical changes, we might never know. Okay, I know that I'm gonna get a lot of hate comments for this. After all, what in the world is Luxray, of all Gen 4 Pokemon, doing in a video discussing underwhelming Pokemon? It's probably one of the last Pokemon you'd even give the word underwhelming to, since nearly everyone uses it in their playthroughs. And yeah, don't get me wrong, Luxray is a solid team member, but I honestly think one of the main reasons why it gets used in everybody's team is because it's one of the few electric types in Sinnoh at all. In Diamond and Pearl, its competition consists of Pachirisu and Raichu. And look at its stats. They're great for an early game Pokemon, right? Yeah, they are. So what's the big deal here? What kind of a clown is making this video? Well, Luxray's one big issue is its severe lack of coverage in Gen 4, even for an electric type, which is saying a lot. Its level of move list consists of just electric and dark type moves, which isn't horrible, but the problem lies in the fact that despite being meant to be a hard-hitting physical attacker, it's really hard to say that with its lack of strong stab moves. When your best electric move is a 65 base power spark, that 120 attack stat suddenly seems not as good. The first thing I change is the obvious. Give it an extra dark typing. Yeah, it's cliche at this point, and at first glance, it doesn't make a ton of sense. But I think its color scheme and mystical ability to see through walls justifies giving it a magical secondary type like dark. This would also fix its lack of good stab options, as now it would be able to use crunch more effectively. Speaking of types, it needs a lot more type coverage. The first 3 moves I'd give would be the elemental fangs as level 1 moves, which is honestly a no-brainer decision given that many other fanged Pokemon get it at level 1, so I don't understand why Luxray can't get it at level 1 too. I'd also give it Howl as an early game move since its dex entry in Legend states that they live in packs, Extrasensory to illustrate its supernatural ability to see through walls, Sucker Punch since it's able to sneak up on enemies in the dark, and lastly Dig because for some completely bizarre reason it's just never been able to learn it, despite its feline appearance. Finally, we need to get rid of Rivalry. It's far too situational to do any good, and it usually just ends up as a cripple to Luxray in most playthroughs. I think instead, No Guard is fitting, seeing as pretty much all of its dex entries state that it has X-ray vision, so being able to detect any prey regardless of if it's underground or flying would make sense. It also would make all of its Fang moves 100% accurate, which is good. Luxray was never a bad Pokemon in Gen 4, but its wasted potential to be a whole lot better is pretty unfortunate. Sadly though, I can't really say the same for the rest in this video. Let's be real here. Being a pure water type is hard. You're the blandest of the bland, having the most common type in the game and not having an extra type to distinguish yourself. There are quite a few pure water types I can think of that have become forgotten, such as Seeking, Golduck, and Lovedisk. So of course, in Gen 4, they decided to add yet another one to spend its days flopping in this sad little boat. This of course being the poor Lumineon. To give you an idea of how underwhelming it is, it's become notorious because of how forgotten it was. And that makes sense given its mediocre stats besides speed. It's a shame because I really love Lumineon, and I think there are some ways to help it. Firstly, we need some small stat boosts. I'd increase its speed by 10 to give it a cheeky base 101 speed, and increase its special attack by 20 so that it can actually deal damage. My second upgrade for it is a big one, but for newer games, I would give it a second fairy typing. Its dex entries constantly mention its dazzling lights and beautiful appearance, so while it's not the strongest contender for a fairy typing, it's certainly more deserving of it than some others. As for moves, there's a ton of wasted potential here. The fact that it can produce bright lights makes me feel like it should get Charge Beam and Confuse Ray since they're both Ray-like moves. Speaking of rays and light, it could also get Psybeam, Aurora Beam, Signal Beam, and Flash Cannon, giving it a lot more much-needed coverage. And lastly, for a good setup move, it could get Tail Glow. I know this doesn't sound like it makes any sense, but it's never explicitly stated that the light has to come from its tail in the move descriptions. In later games, it could get Quiver Dance as a second option to boost, along with Dazzling Gleam and Moonblast for fairy-type stab. Lumineon has always been a Pokemon strictly there just to exist, just to add extra ambience to the Pokemon world. But I think with these changes, Lumineon could actually be a decent threat and a valuable team member. As I said earlier, Generation 4 was the moment where most Pokemon finally got wide move pools, and there's no other type that got a bigger buff than the Bug type. Prior to Gen 4, the Bug type seemed to solely exist to teach players not to use it. There were very few good Bug type moves, and the ones that were good usually were only learnable by a few Bug type Pokemon. But in Gen 4, we finally got good, accessible bug moves in X-Scissor, U-Turn, and Bug Buzz. Still though, some bug types never really got to shine despite these major improvements, and a prime example of this is Wormadam. I'll be honest, I always liked Burmy and Wormadam's designs. I think the gimmick of Wormadam's type being based on where it evolved is really neat. Sadly, what isn't so neat are its stats. A 424 base stat total for a Pokemon that you have to wait 6 real-life hours to obtain? You might as well beat the game at that time. Anyway, let's try and make this thing somewhat viable in a playthrough. If you saw my Fixing Gen 3 Pokemon video, you probably remember how I made Castform's 3 forms have different stat distributions. Well, conveniently, Wormadam's 3 forms already have different distributions, so all I'm really going to do is increase their base stat totals by 40. They're clearly meant to be defensive, slow Pokemon that specialize either in physical or special moves, but their current stats just don't reflect that strongly enough. I'd increase the Grass Cloak's special defense and attack by 20, the Sandy Cloak's physical defense and attack by 20, and both of the Trash Cloak's defenses by 20. As for moves, here's where I'd have them seriously diverge. Knowing that they're all defensive Pokemon, the Plant Cloak should get Giga Drain, Leech Seed, and Toxic Spikes by level up. The Sandy Cloak should get Earthquake, Stealth Rock, and Sandstorm, and the Trash Cloak should get Metal Burst, Gyro Ball, Spikes, and Curse. As for level up moves that all 3 of them could learn, I'd give them Sucker Punch as a reference to their cloak being great for camouflage, as well as Stockpile, Swallow, and Spit Up since they collect their surrounding materials for their cloaks. And I know that some of you are probably wondering about Mothim, the male counterpart. Well, I'll be honest, Mothim is more of a lost cause since there are so many other Pokemon who are just better than it. But I guess the logical answer is to give it more speed, Sleep Powder, and Compound Eyes. Lastly, I think giving Wormadam Thick Fat or Magic Guard as a second ability would be cool. Thick Fat is to reduce its ice and fire weaknesses since it has a thick cloak, and while Magic Guard seems strange for a normal looking bug Pokemon, for some unknown reason, Wormadam can learn Psychic and Ghost attacks, so I feel like they have some sort of magical powers hidden in their cloaks, or at least the cloak itself has some magical properties. I know it's a lot of buffs for an early game Pokemon, but honestly, is it really early game if you have to wait 6 hours to get one? Wormadam deserved so much more than what it got. You know, Gen 4 has a lot of very popular Pokemon, and it's honestly kinda difficult trying to think of forgettable Gen 4 Pokemon. Yes, Lumineon is often the target of being the most forgotten Pokemon in history, but that alone has given it a newfound reputation. But one Pokemon that has really fallen through the cracks of obscurity is Carnivine. I'm sure you've heard of it, but how many of you have actually used one on a team? Actually, how many of you even know where to catch it in Gen 4? Well, I'll tell you where it is, the Great Marsh. Of course, being one of the hardest Pokemon to find, but even if you did catch one, you'd be rewarded with a disappointing team member. Just like many of the Pokemon mentioned above, one of Carnivine's biggest problems is its stats. It's basically the Seviper of grass types, being a solid mixed attacker with mediocre defenses and poor speed. However, unlike Seviper, I think making it a glass cannon doesn't fit with its behavior as it mostly spends its time waiting for prey to come near. So I don't think giving it a lot of speed would make sense. I also really don't see why it has 90 special attacks since almost all of its level up moves are physical, and I mean, its whole thing is chomping on prey, so I'd lower it to 60 while raising its physical attack by 10, its HP by 10, and both of its defenses by 10. But that's not Carnivine's biggest problem. Like a lot of other grass types, it suffers from having a shallow move pool. Having Crunch for dark type coverage is nice, but just like Luxray, I'd go as far as to give it the 3 elemental fangs, but instead only as move reminder moves, since this decision is a bit out there compared to Luxray. I also think giving it poison attacks like Poison Fang and Gunk Shot would work well given that Venus flytraps use acid to dissolve their prey, and for those wanting to deal with its low speed, it could also get Sucker Punch to lean into the fact that Carnivine traps prey by surprise. In newer games, it could also get Strength Sap to reference its method of eating, as well as Snap Trap because, I mean, it's a Venus fly trap. Lastly, while Levitate isn't a bad ability, it doesn't help Carnivine all that much given that it already resists ground moves. Instead, it should get Arena Trap as its second ability because, again, fly trap. And for a hidden ability in newer games, Strong Jaw would be fun to boost its biting attacks. I don't think Carnivine will become the next top tier threat, but it'll at least make it a worthy reward for players who decide to catch one, instead of being one of the most forgettable Pokemon in existence. But now, it's time to go to the very bottom of the barrel and talk about, literally, the weakest Gen 4 Pokemon. Everyone's favorite musical catastrophe, Kricketune. Now, before you rush to the comments, yes, I know, it's an early game bug who isn't supposed to be incredible. Yes, it becomes fully evolved at just level 10. But you know who else becomes fully evolved at level 10? Butterfree. You know who else are early game bugs that can pull their way through an entire playthrough? Heracross, Leavanny, Ninjask, and of course, the aforementioned Butterfree. There is no excuse, it's just laughably weak, having a gag-inducing 384 base stat total. Not to mention that you have to deal with Kricketot for several levels, who doesn't even get a proper attacking move before evolving. Again, I get that it's not supposed to be the biggest powerhouse, but I'd take almost any other early game bug over Kricketune. This thing needs a complete makeover, and I think I have an idea. The first thing I do to patch it up is to rearrange its stats. Its stat distribution is really awkward and doesn't make much sense. A slow, frail physical attacker with strangely high HP compared to its other stats? What is it supposed to do? I think its physical defense should be raised by 40 and its special defense by 20, which design-wise fits because crickets have hard exoskeletons. Next, I'd actually lower its physical attack to 75. I'll explain this change later. A base stat total of 434 is still low, but it's a lot better than the nearly useless bug we currently have. Now, as for moves, here's where Kricketune's design will finally come to life. Being an orchestra conductor, I'd imagine Kricketune's primary role to be to support the rest of its team, or rather, its orchestra. So why not give it some basic support moves like Reflect and Light Screen, as well as more flavorful stuff like Heal Bell, Encore, and Baton Pass to demonstrate its musical side. For its attacks, it could get moves involving its two sharp arms such as Karate Chop, Air Slash, Cross Poison, and Twin Needle. Lastly, and most importantly, its abilities. Swarm doesn't really help a slow Pokemon like Kricketune, and I feel like it's just the generic ability given to so many bug types. And it doesn't even thematically fit Kricketune's design. Starting in Gen 5, it also gets Technician as a hidden ability, but I would straight up replace Swarm with it since I'm pretty sure that being a skilled musician, it probably has the proper technique to use its attacks more effectively. But for its second ability, I wanted to give it something unique. So much like I did with Magcargo and Dugong, it's gonna get a custom ability, which I'll name Soloist. What it does is, if Kricketune is the last remaining member, its attack and speed will be raised by one stage, making its nerfed 75 base attack way stronger, but it'll only activate if there are more than one Pokemon in your team. This makes you choose between using Kricketune as either a supportive setup Pokemon or using it as a trump card that could win you a battle. Maybe then, Kricketune will actually be sought after for once. To start things off, let's look at a Pokemon that I'm sure some of you have encountered in your Gen 5 playthroughs, but most likely never considered using it on a team. Actually, there are probably a lot of you who just forgot about it, that being Maractus, aka Cacturn Jr. It's got everything that you need in an underwhelming Pokemon, a bland typing, an out-of-the-way location, and an average stat distribution. Actually, now that I think about it, it's basically a grass-type Seviper in terms of its stats. And we all know just how fantastic Seviper is. There's little reason to use Maractus over other Gen 5 pure grass types. I think Maractus is really cute, so here's what I do to make it a little more appealing. Firstly, despite its stats not really standing out all that much, I think they're fine for a mid-game grass type. I think just increasing its defenses and speed by 10 would be a good buff. My big issue with Maractus though is just that it's so bland. More specifically, its move pool is bland. Like, they really made a cactus Pokemon based on maracas and barely gave it anything thematic? We have a lot to work with here. I think it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to give it a few water-type moves by level ups such as Water Gun early on and Hydro Pump much later. This would give it a way of dealing with fire types and kinda makes sense given that cactuses contain high volumes of water, which Maractus can probably expel at will. More moves based on its design that I'd give are the two Spikes moves, Leech Seed, Twin Needle, and maybe Counter, since I'd imagine that punching a cactus would hurt. Next, to lean into its musical design, it could also get moves such as Encore and Teeter Dance to mess with opponents, Heal Bell for status healing, Quiver Dance to boost, which it surprisingly has never been able to learn. And lastly, Stored Power. This seems like a weird choice since it's a Psychic type move, and Maractus does not look like it has Psychic powers. However, seeing as cactuses are succulent plants that store water in their stems, I think from a design standpoint it kinda makes sense. Finally, I think Maractus's two abilities fit both from a thematic and gameplay perspective. I was originally thinking of giving it Simple as a reference to its not super unique design, but that would probably be too broken with Acupressure. Still though, I think what Maractus really needed was a move pool enhancement, and these subtle additions should help it stand out now and give the little cactus some love that it desperately wants. Good old Stunfisk, the Dunsparce of Unova. I mean, I guess it does have a cool ground electric typing and also cool Galarian form, but in its debut generation, I seriously doubt anyone is using this fish that's flatter than my personality on a team. If you want one in black and white, you're gonna have to wait until the 7th gym. If you want it in the sequels, you have to wait until after beating the champion to get it. I mean, even Dunsparce got an evolution, so I feel like poor Stunfisk deserves some love too. Stunfisk's stat distribution is clearly geared towards being a defensive sponge. While this isn't really optimal for a single player playthrough, I don't have a problem with it. I'd probably just swap its physical and special attack stats, and then give it 10 more physical defense. As for its level up learn set, I would replace Thundershock and Thunderbolt with Spark and Wild Charge since I'm opting to make it a physical attacker. For ground type stab, it could get Bulldoze early on to cover its low speed, and then Earthquake later on. Outside of stab though, there are a couple of moves that it could get that are related to its design. Crunch and Sucker Punch would give it some nice coverage and fit into its behavior of waiting for prey to come to it, while Curse and Pain Split should be part of its level of learn set instead of being egg moves to support its high HP and defenses. It could also get Iron Head to reference the fact that its entire body is apparently hard enough to resist even a sumo wrestler. Finally, Stunfisk's 3 abilities are Static, Limber, and Sandveil. Static synergizes well with Stunfisk's defensive stat spread, but Limber is completely useless for an electric type. I would replace it with Levitate since it's been shown to be able to fly in the anime. Yeah, this does sort of remove Electros's niche, but it would still be the only Pokemon without a weakness. Plus, Stunfisk is pretty forgettable as is, so I don't think it would hurt to tag on an ability that makes it a bit more noteworthy as an electric type. Between generations 2 and 6, there was one type that stood above the rest in terms of its unrivaled ferocity and power, the Dragon type. Having 4 common resistances, 2 rare weaknesses, and only being resisted by Steel types, Dragon types were the undisputed powerhouses of the Pokemon world. Each new generation saw even stronger dragons being introduced, with every single one of them displaying some level of terror or mystique. But then, in Gen 5, there was Druddigon. Outclassed in almost every single way. Poor design, unimpressive stats compared to other dragons, and it's only found towards the end of the game. I feel like Druddigon has a lot of unused potential, so I'm gonna try to give it that. Druddigon's dex entries state that its skin is tougher than rock, which is kind of reflected in its stats, but base 90 for defense is still kinda low in my opinion. I feel like raising its physical defense by 20 would do it more justice. Now I actually think one of Druddigon's strong points is its move pool. Especially in black and white too, it's got a ton of coverage options to make its base 120 attack pretty scary. But for those who want to use it defensively, adding Spikes and Stealth Rock makes sense design-wise and give it some good utility. But if you want to use it as an all-out attacker, it could get Head Smash, Iron Head, and Zen Headbutt to showcase its rock-solid head. Lastly, Druddigon's 2 main abilities are great. Rough Skin lets it punish incoming physical attacks, and Sheer Force makes moves with secondary effects deal enormous damage. However, I don't really find its hidden ability, Mold Breaker, to be all that appealing. I thought about it for a bit and decided that having Solid Rock instead would give it a second defensive ability that would give Druddigon the unique advantage of taking less damage from its weaknesses. Sure, it'll probably still be disliked due to its design and slowness, but for the few who don't judge it by its cover, they'll be surprised at its immense utility. And now, we have the last 2 Pokemon of this video. Possibly the 2 most forgotten Pokemon out of the 156. They both share some common traits: late game, out of the way, and completely outclassed by their peers who can be obtained much earlier. The first of the 2 is the less bad one, Beheeyem. It really hurts because I love its design. It's an alien with the power to manipulate opponents' thoughts at will. Sadly, it won't be controlling much with its 40 speed and 75 defense. You want to hit hard? Use Reuniclus. You want to take hits? Use Musharna. And even if you're looking for some sort of middle ground, Gothitelle just does it so much better. There's really no reason to use it. I want Behem to stand out and be a viable choice for a playthrough, so let's do that. Almost every single dex entry paints Behem in a bad light, mentioning its ability to control the minds of others and tendency to abduct Dubwool living in farms. And its shady overcoat design represents this perfectly. This might be a controversial choice, but I'd slap on the dark typing. This will give it a 4x bug weakness instead of just a 2x1, but you're probably already not keeping Behem in against a bug type, so I feel like the defensive benefits of an extra dark type outweigh the cons. This would also make it the only psychic dark type at that point, further alienating it from the psychic type crowd. As for stats, I was a bit stumped. Obviously, it's supposed to be a hard-hitting, slow special attacker, but that's kinda just what Reuniclus does, but worse. Well, surely mind control requires a ton of brain power, right? So I think it would be fun to raise its special attack by 20, and now it's got the trait of being the hardest-hitting non-legendary psychic type. Yes, its 40 speed will still make it vulnerable, but I feel like that drawback is a little more justifiable now. As for its moveset, I think Behem already has a solid move pool, but I want to give it some moves for its new dual dark typing and its design. For new dark type moves, I'd give it Nasty Plot and Night Daze. I know that Night Daze is Zoroark's signature move in Gen 5, but blinding your opponent with Dark Wave? There's no way that doesn't also fit for Behem. I would also give it Cosmic Power, Will-O-Wisp, Confuse Ray, Hex, and Flash Cannon to illustrate its alien characteristics. Lastly, while Analytic is great and Synchronize is okay, Telepathy is kinda useless. Now, this is going to be a pretty broken suggestion, but I feel like Shadow Tag would fit Behem a lot better than it does on Gothitelle. I mean, it could use its mind-controlling powers to stop the enemy from fleeing. I gotta say, Behem is probably my favorite design out of all of the Gen 5 Psychic types. It's just a shame that it had so many things done wrong with it to make it so forgettable. But if you thought Behem was extremely forgettable, at least it could be saved. This final Pokemon is one very similar to Magcargo. I'm not sure if there's much that could be reasonably done to make it worth your time at all. All of the Pokemon I've talked about so far in this video have some incentive to be used in a playthrough, even if they're a bit out of the way. Maractus will be your strongest grass type at that point. Stunfisk has a unique typing. Druddigon is the easiest dragon type to get. Behem, looks cool. But Heatmore, why do you exist? You can't find it until the very end of the game, and even then, it's not a common encounter, so there's a good chance you'll never see one in your playthrough. And even if you do decide to catch one, you'll be greeted with one of the most mediocre fire types of all time. A late game, completely outclassed, forgettably designed Pokemon? I'm not sure how it can be fixed. If you look at its base stat total, 484 doesn't seem too bad, but then you look at its distribution. Wow, it's almost like I've seen this exact same distribution somewhere else. Look, being a mixed attacker is cool and all, but it's useless if you're too frail to take a hit and too slow to move first. I decided to increase its physical and special attack by 5 each, its defenses by 10, and its HP by 10. Yeah, believe it or not, no speed buff. I just don't think that Heatmore would be a very fast-acting Pokemon, so more speed wouldn't really make sense. As for level-up moves, I wanted to take advantage of what is perhaps Heatmore's only cool trait, its ability to use its fire like a tongue. And what better way to help it out than with Power Whip? It's stronger than Giga Drain, covers all 3 of its weaknesses, and sorta makes sense. Bulldoze and Earthquake would also fit in well with the size of Anteaters, as well as Heatmore's behavior of hunting for ants. I would also tack on Rock Slide as a reference to Univa's Victory Road being a steep cliff, probably prone to a lot of rock slides. Scald could be another coverage option based off of its tail that emits steam that would make Heatmore stand out more. And lastly, Flame Charge to patch up its speed, and also because how can a fire type not learn a basic fire type move like Flame Charge? Lastly, for its abilities, I think Flash Fire is fine, but Gluttony is pretty useless. One of Heatmore's biggest problems is that it doesn't have a single super impressive stat, so I decided to give a new ability to work around this. Why not have a little fun and replace Gluttony with Defiant? After all, Heatmore's entire existence is centered around hunting Durant, or in other words, defying ants. Yeah, you can boo me for that one. We're gonna start things off with a Pokemon that at first doesn't seem like it belongs here at all. I'm talking about Kalos' pseudo-legendary Goodra. You're probably wondering why I'm even mentioning it at all since its stats are great. I mean, it's a pseudo-legendary. How can it be underwhelming at all? Well, there's a reason why Goodra is never really talked about or used by most people, and that's because compared to every other pseudo-legendary, Goodra is significantly worse. Sure, it's amazing at taking special hits, but everything else is just alright to straight up mediocre, especially when you have to deal with Goomy and Sliggoo for 20 levels. It's just not special enough to make you want to wait longer to use it over the other dragons available. So let's fix that. Honestly, I'm alright with Goodra's stats staying the way they are, and I think rearranging them in any reasonable way would make it too similar to its Hisuian form. So the first change I'd make is one that I have no clue why isn't already a thing, which is to give it a secondary water typing. Its dex entries state that it loves the rain, it evolves in the rain, and can learn surf, so why Game Freak made it a pure dragon type is completely beyond me. I've seen some people also suggest the poison type, but I didn't want Goodra to overshadow Dragalge. As for new moves, I feel like there's a lot of stuff it could get based on dex entries. As a Goomy, it could get Struggle Bug to reference the fact that it's called the weakest dragon Pokemon and is a slug. It could also get moves like Recover, Acid Spray, Coil, and Mud Bomb because of its muddy habitat. Once it evolves, it can get moves such as Drain Punch, Mega Horn, and Iron Head since it's stated that Goodra's horns and punches can hit harder than 100 pro boxers. Lastly, as an upgrade to Mud Shot, it could get Earth Power. And for its abilities, while Hydration is pretty decent, Sap Sipper is a bit unfitting. I was originally thinking of swapping it with Thick Fat since Goodra has a thick layer of fat to protect it, but I ultimately decided on Magic Guard, which seems less fitting, but it's mentioned to have an extremely hard to break layer of slime on top of its fat, making attacks slide off. So perhaps that slime has the magical properties of shielding it from things like poison and weather. And plus, it would very heavily increase Goodra's defensive capabilities, making it actually worthy of the pseudo-legendary status. For the first, and probably only, time ever, I decided to include a Pika clone. Now, Dedenne isn't a particularly awful Pokemon, especially compared to the rest on this list. However, I want to talk about it because it has by far the most wasted potential out of every Pika clone up to this point. I mean, Game Freak clearly thought it was special because they gave it the super powerful Fairy typing. Unfortunately though, it can't make much use of that Fairy typing because the only Fairy attack it gets in Gen 6 is Play Rough. It's a good move, but not on a Pokemon with a base 58 attack stat. For a Pokemon that's so hard to find in its introductory games, I think it deserves better. As for its stats, I don't want to buff it too much in the spirit of Pika clones being relatively weak, so all I do is raise its physical defense by 10 and its speed by 5. Now, here's where Dedenne's real buffs will come, its moves. Multiple dex entries describe its tendency to drain power from people's homes, so I think giving it Draining Kiss and Parabolic Charge would fit perfectly. And plus, it gets Parabolic Charge in later generations, so it makes perfect sense to give it in Gen 6. Another draining move I'd like to add that is kind of out there but would immensely help Dedenne stand out is Giga Drain, which is in reference to the fact that it steals electricity and energy from other Pokemon for itself. Some more flavorful extras I'd give are Dazzling Gleam as its new best Fairy Stab, Signal Beam because it sends electrical signals, Stockpile, Spit Up, Swallow, and Stored Power, which is due to the fact that it stores the energy it takes from other Pokemon. Lastly, the only ability change I'd make is replacing Pickup with Static since I'd imagine touching one would lead to some shocking consequences. With these changes, I think we would have finally seen the first truly viable Pika clone outside of the Pikachu line. It's a shame that it never was. Here we have a case of a Pokemon with a really interesting gimmick, but none of the stats to back it up. You see, Meowstic is a cool designed Pokemon with a lot of potential that's extremely underwhelming for no reason. It has the cool trait of its gender affecting its moveset, with the male being status oriented and the female being offense based. However, weirdly, besides attack and speed, everything else is balanced. Unfortunately, with a base stat total of 466, that just means that everything is mediocre. So the first change would be to rearrange their stats. To better fit their intended roles, I'd reduce the male's speed by 50, increase both of its defenses by 25, and increase its HP by 10. For the female, I'd take away 20 defense points and give it to its special attack, and then give it 10 more speed. For new moves, the male already has a lot of support moves, so I would just give it Wish, Taunt, Confuse Ray, Counter, and Mirror Coat since the male's role is to defend their partner. The female, on the other hand, could use a couple of new coverage moves since it is a bit lacking in that field. It's stated in pretty much every dex entry that female Meowstic's psychic powers are unbelievably strong, so to showcase that, it could get Nasty Plot, Focus Blast, Mystical Fire, Draining Kiss, and Hex, which are all moves that involve some sort of either magical or evil power. Besides that though, I'm fine with their abilities as is. Infiltrator is nice, Kenai fits design-wise, and their hidden abilities work well with what Game Freak was trying to do with them. I say trying to because even though they were clearly made to serve different roles, what we ended up getting were two forgettable Pokemon with incredibly mediocre stats, who sadly, because of that, never got to fully show their true potential. Speaking of forgettable, here's one I'm sure none of you used on your first team, Trevenant. I really like Phantom's design. It's a cute little phantom tree, and Trevenant is pretty cool too. Sadly though, it's been cursed with alright stats and a weirdly limited level up move list. I mean, whose idea was it to make Phantom not get a single usable ghost or grass attack until level 45? Looking at Trevenant's stats, I'm kind of getting a Carnivine vibe here, where it's slightly bulky, hits pretty hard, and moves really slow. I can't see Trevenant moving fast, so I think just giving 10 points to each defensive stat is all that I can realistically do to buff its stats. For new moves, we need to start with Phantom, because god, this thing is unusable. Despite having a lower special attack stat, I think Hex works fine as a mid-game ghost move that synergizes well with a Will-O-Wisp. For Grass Stab, it could get Razor Leaf because, well, it has leaves, and also because there aren't any other low-power physical grass moves that fit better. Once it evolves, I think Hornleech and Woodhammer should be swapped since that makes more sense. For some coverage, and to play into its vengeful nature, it could get Payback, Sucker Punch, Drain Punch, Play Rough, Pain Split, and Glare. Finally, as a bit of a controversial pick, I think it would be really cool to give it the 3 order moves that are normally exclusive to Vespiquen. Several entries state that it can control the trees in its forest, so I could imagine Trevenant being able to ward off unwanted visitors by commanding the trees to do its work. But then again, the move's animation shows bees attacking the enemy, so perhaps Trevenant could get its own exclusive moves that have a similar effect. I think these changes would go a long way to making Trevenant something more than just an overlooked Pokemon, drowned in a sea of so many other better peers. If you thought the previous 3 were bad, you're in for a real treat, because these last 2 Pokemon are ones that I genuinely have no clue if can be fixed without completely going against their design. The first of the 2 is Avalugg, a Pokemon that makes 0 sense whatsoever. Its stats are pretty similar to Aggron's. Problem is, it's a pure Ice type, the worst defensive type in the game. I mean, I don't even think there's anything I can do to its stat distribution that makes sense, because it does make perfect sense. I guess give it 20 more special defense so that it doesn't faint to a single special move? As for its type, well, I was considering making it part steel since its body is as hard as steel, but I decided against that since it's not actually made out of steel and that extra typing does come with severe drawbacks. I don't know, how do you feel about it? For moves, some no-brainers would be Heavy Slam and Body Press, which were given in later games, so I don't see why they can't be in its Gen 6 move list. For Ice variety, Ice Shard would be a nice way to get some priority and should have already been a thing since Avalugg is entirely made out of ice. Then Icicle Spear could be an earlier move for Bergmite because, well, it's an iceberg. Finally, because of its powerful skull and fangs, I think some nice hard scale moves could be Zen Headbutt, Head Smash, Iron Head, and the 2 other elemental fangs. Yeah, Fire Fang and Thunder Fang are a stretch, but let's be honest, Avalugg needs all the help it can get. Lastly, both Ice Body and Own Tempo are not super great abilities on Avalugg. I think two fitting abilities that would function better are Filter, since it's mentioned that overnight, Avalugg is able to repair its entire body. This would sort of help it on the defensive side, which is what Avalugg was made for anyway. For its second ability, I would give it Strong Jaw. Yeah, I know Hisuian Avalugg gets this ability already, but does that even matter? Sadly though, without completely overhauling the Ice type as a whole, Avalugg is still forever cursed as being a defensive beast, with a typing that has absolutely nothing to do with defense. And finally, let's talk about what might be the worst fossil Pokemon in existence. It's yet another strangely slow and defensive Ice type, one of the saddest, underwhelming Pokemon cases of all time. Poor old Aurorus. Oh man, this thing has everything going against it. A shallow move pool, a bad typing, and to top it all off, a stat distribution that makes no sense for an Ice Rock type, which is arguably even worse than pure Ice defensively. Seriously, I don't think it's ever been this obvious which fossil Pokemon to choose in a game, so let's try to give Aurorus some reason to use over Tyrantrum. Looking at its stats, Aurorus is yet another Pokemon that falls into the weird position of having one really high and one really low stat, with everything else being alright. Problem is, a 521 base stat total is already really high, so I can't really increase its stats all that much. Honestly, I'd probably just enhance its special walling properties a bit more and increase its special defense by 10. It still sucks, but I really don't think Aurorus' base stat total passing the 540s makes any sense. For new moves, firstly, just like Avalugg, Body Press and Heavy Slam fit well since it's a heavyweight Pokemon. Secondly, and this is a big one, give it Power Gem. Seriously, how in the world has it never been able to learn this move despite having literal gems all over its body? I would have loved to give it Diamond Storm as well because of the same reason and because it would greatly help it defensively, but it's exclusive to a mythical Pokemon, so I ultimately decided against it. Next, a lot of its dex entries painted in an elegant light, mentioning its diamond-shaped crystals and beautiful howls, so some moves to illustrate that would be Hyper Voice, Dazzling Gleam, and Charge Beam. The last two moves I want to give it are kind of a stretch since Aurorus is a dinosaur, but I feel like Dragon Dance, Wild Charge, and Outrage could sort of fit, since being a sauropod, while it's mostly gentle, if threatened, it has the power to destroy anything in its path. Dragon Dance is mostly just to help out Aurorus' speed stat, and also because if Tyrantrum can be a full-on dragon, I don't see why Aurorus can't get some dragon moves. To start, let's look at a Pokemon that seems perfectly fine at first glance. Vikavolt. This has to be one of the coolest bug Pokemon designs ever. I mean, an electric beetle that's shaped like a railgun? How could you not like it? Unfortunately though, it has arguably the most bizarre and unexplainable stat distribution of any Pokemon. Yes, even more than the cat. Apparently, Vikavolt zips around and flusters opponents with acrobatic flying maneuvers, which is perfectly illustrated with the base 43 speed stat. I get that its special attack is amazing, but did they really have to make it slower than Caterpie? It's also made worse when you realize that you can't evolve Charjabug until the very end of the game in Gen 7, so Vikavolt really should be a much better reward. So yeah, stat-wise, this is a very straightforward fix. I'd lower its physical attack, physical defense, and special defense by 10 each and give it to its speed stat, and then give it an extra 20 to bump it up to 93. Yeah, it's kind of a zero brain cell min-max situation, but I don't think there's any other stat distribution that's fitting for Vikavolt. As for moves it could get in its debut, I think Dazzling Gleam would be a good coverage move that sort of makes sense since I'd imagine its electric beams to be blinding. Speaking of beams, some projectile-based moves it could get are Power Gem, Focus Blast, and Electro Ball. Lastly, just as an obligatory addition, I have to give it U-Turn. Not only does it strangely never get this move, but with its high speed, it cannot properly use it if you need to switch out. But honestly, besides those minor tweaks, I don't think Vikavolt really needs much else. Its move pool is pretty good and Levitate is fitting, giving it a nice ground immunity. I don't know, maybe give it Volt Absorb if you want electric healing, but really, Vikavolt just isn't that bad. At least, it's not when compared to the rest in this video. Mushroom Pokemon tend to be very hit or miss. On one hand, you have awesome Pokemon like Breloom, but then you have Pokemon like Parasect and, more importantly, Shiinotic. It's a really cool design, especially when paired with its Pokédex entries, but unfortunately, as menacing as it looks, its stats say the opposite. I mean, wow, I didn't expect Shiinotic to be this bad when looking it up. This thing is on the same level as Pokemon such as Butterfree, Delcatty, and even Charjabug. Now, in the spirit of Morello being obtained early on, I don't want to make Shiinotic a beast, but a base stat total of 405 is just criminal, especially for a Gen 7 Pokemon. So I've decided to give it 20 more HP, 10 more special attack, and 10 more special defense. 445 is still pretty low, but it's much more viable than what it had before. For new moves, while Shiinotic has some cool options, there's definitely more it could get in relation to its behavior of sucking the life out of sleeping opponents and its dazzling lights. Firstly, I think some level up moves that would help it out on the utility side are Leech Seed to complement its defensive stat spread, Hex to synergize with Spore, Will-O-Wisp, and Heal Pulse since decks entries state that it can transfer energy to its allies if needed. For coverage, in reference to the light it can create, I think as a Morello it could get Psybeam and Mirror Shot, and then once it evolves, Flash Cannon, Focus Blast, and Signal Beam would help it out a lot. Finally, I think Trick Room would be nice to patch its low speed and because it uses Trickery to confuse its opponent. For abilities, while Illuminate is perfect design-wise, it's completely useless. I'd replace it with Regenerator since mushrooms are known to have regenerative properties, and it would work well with its increased HP stat, turning it into a frightening support Pokemon that can also deal devastating damage if it needs to, finally giving some justice to its spooky design. You know, I talked about Druddigon in my Fixing Gen 5 video and how it was one of the worst dragon types of all time. Well, today, I think there might actually be a competitor for that title, Turtonator. Starting with Goodra, it seems like Game Freak decided to continue the trend of giving the dragon type to Pokemon that aren't dragons at all. While Turtonator beats Druddigon in originality, it sadly offers very little in the way of desirability. Because not only is it a Pokemon Sun exclusive, it's only found towards the very end of the game, and once you catch it, you're met with what is essentially a Dragon-type Heatmor, and I think we all know just how underwhelming Heatmor is. To start, Turtonator is obviously meant to be a tank that can hit decently hard, and I don't want to take that trait away from it, so I just decided to give it 20 more HP and 10 more special defense. For new moves, Turtonator honestly has a pretty wide variety of moves as is, but some extras that would greatly help it out are Stealth Rock and Spikes, as a reference to the hard material on its shell, Sludge Wave because it's been referenced to excrete poisonous gas from its nostrils, Sucker Punch because of its behavior of waiting to trap prey, and Earth Power for better ground type coverage. Lastly, and most importantly, Turtonator needs a better ability. Sure, Shell Armor isn't terrible, but is blocking critical hits really that important most of the time? I think another ability that would fit is Solid Rock. Solid Rock is in reference to its rock-hard shell that it probably uses as a shield against attacks during fights, helping out its defensive shortcomings. Another ability that it could also get is Flame Body, punishing opponents that touch its dangerous shell. Sure, Turtonator won't be the greatest dragon type in Alola, but I think Game Freak really could have leaned more into its defensive stat spread to make it fare just a bit better in battle. Now that we're at Gen 8, I can finally give the reason why I decided to lump Gens 7 to 9 together into one video. You see, Gen 8 doesn't really have that many bad Pokemon. Sure, many of their designs suck, but gameplay-wise, most of them are perfectly fine and have some redeeming aspects or a gimmick that makes them interesting. But of course, there are still a few underwhelming ones. The first being Graplocked, a deep-sea Pokemon that surprisingly isn't a water type. Honestly, I don't have a big problem with that since it's cool seeing underwater Pokemon without the water type. Graplocked's main issue is that its move pool is pretty underwhelming, especially seeing how it gets Technician as a hidden ability, so let's fix that. First though, I'm just gonna bump its special defense by 10 to make it a bit bulkier against psychic attacks. I don't have a problem with it being slow since it's an octopus, so I wouldn't expect it to move very fast. The new moves I would give it would be Coil and Recover because of the flexibility and regenerative properties of octopuses, Storm Throw, Revenge, Flip Turn, Aqua Jet, and Bullet Punch for the Technician boost, Power Whip because it could probably use its arms as whips, then Lunge and Payback for some fighting style moves. Lastly, the only ability change I'd make is to make Technician a regular ability since hidden abilities are notoriously difficult to get even in the modern games. And Graplock being able to unleash really powerful storm throws would give it a really unique niche amongst fighting type Pokemon. Graplock is a really cool and unique Pokemon, probably one of my favorites from Gen 8. It's just a shame that it got shafted so hard in the move pool department. Have you ever seen a Pokemon and thought to yourself, what in the world is that thing? Well, that's exactly what I thought of when I first saw Phalanx. Is it a worm? Is it an army of soldiers? Well, it's kinda both. I think the design is pretty cute and has an interesting, although one-dimensional gimmick in No Retreat, which boosts all of its stats but forces it to stay in battle until it faints. Unfortunately, Phalanx doesn't have the staying power to make good use of this move, and the first change I would make to it is to give it a secondary steel typing. I've also seen Bug thrown around as another potential second type, but besides resembling a centipede, it's not actually a bug. I think adding the steel typing would help it out defensively and differentiate it from all the other pure fighting types. As for stats, the only changes I'd make would be to take 10 special attack and give it to its physical defense, and then add on 20 special defense. I feel like Phalanx's design hints at it being a bit slow, but durable and fierce, like a group of heavily armored warriors. As for new moves, Phalanx is already pretty well off in coverage. However, the gimmick of No Retreat hints that it was designed with the playstyle of joining the battle and not leaving until it's over. So to illustrate this fearless nature, some thematic moves I'd give it are Flame Charge, Wild Charge, Attack Order, and Defend Order. I know that the two order moves are exclusive to Vespiquen, but Phalanx's whole design is centered around the leader directing the 5 other soldiers, so I don't think there's a better Pokemon to give these two moves to. I also want to give it Icicle Spear, Pin Missile, Rock Blast, and Spike Cannon both because of the spikes on their heads, but also because I want to give Phalanx an alternative niche. Just like with Turtonator, Battle Armor is an alright ability, and being immune to critical hits is better for Phalanx due to its gimmick, but I think a second ability that would help it out is Skill Link. I mean, what do Phalanx do when battling? They cooperate together and switch formations when needed, or in other words, they skillfully link together. These changes would go a long way in making Phalanx a unique, but more importantly, valuable member for any team. But that's it for Gen 8. Let's look at the newest batch of Pokemon, Generation 9. Generation 9 introduced a lot of things that people wanted for years, such as giving highly requested cross-gen evolutions to Pokemon such as Dunsparce and creating Pokemon with unique type combinations. Out of all of the brand new type combinations though, arguably the most hyped one was Grass Fire, a type that Game Freak had been evading since Sunflora's introduction. Surely Game Freak had to have cooked something incredible, right? Well, we ended up essentially getting Carnivine with an extra fire typing. I mean, the stat distribution is weirdly similar, with Scovillain instead losing some bulk to get more speed. Unfortunately, that doesn't help it much because now it's just more frail while being at an awkward 75 base speed. Once again, I hate having to lean towards min-maxing, but with a Pokemon like Scovillain, we need to massively rework its stats. I take away 20 special attack and 10 speed, evenly distribute the stat points to its HP and defenses, and then add 10 more HP. Yeah, I know I'm making it slower, but given that it's supposed to synergize with Sunny Day, I don't think it's too big of a deal. Now, for moves, Scovillain kind of suffers here. To start things off, I feel like the reason why Scovillain is a mixed attacker is because of the lack of physical fire moves in general. Because fire-type moves are really the only ones that Scovillain uses its special attack stat for, but I don't think it's problematic to give it Flame Charge and Flare Blitz as physical fire attacks. After all, it's known to cause rampages due to the chemicals in its brain. Because of this behavior, I also think that giving it Wild Charge and Outrage would thematically fit and offer some nice coverage. In reference to its fangs, I think giving it Psychic Fangs and Thunderfang would also be nice. And lastly, for a Pokemon that learns multiple Seed moves, I think it's weird that it doesn't get Leech Seed, which would give it some nice utility. Looking at Scovillain's 3 abilities, Chlorophyll is clearly its best ability. Moody can be chaotic if you're lucky, and Insomnia is nice to prevent sleep. My only change would be to replace Insomnia with Water Absorb, since I'd imagine Scovillain to be so hot to the point where water doesn't affect it. Besides that though, I think Scovillain now has some nice tools to help it stand out in battle, something that it greatly deserves, being the first ever Grass and Fire type Pokemon. But now, we have the definitively worst Gen 9 Pokemon. As you might expect, it's a bug type, one whose unusability sits among the likes of other bugs such as Ledian and Kricketune. Yes, a Pokemon in Generation 9 who is as bad, if not worse, than Pokemon from 20 years ago, when Pokemon were much weaker in general. It's almost baffling how weak Game Freak decided to make it. But who is this Pokemon, you may ask? Well, it's none other than Spidops. Not only is it the least cool spider design, but it's probably one of the least cool bug type designs ever. And to top it all off, this thing has an abysmal 404 base stat total. I hate to say it, but I think even Ledian is more useful than Spidops, which is saying a lot. This thing needs a big makeover. Firstly, looking at its dex entries and stat distribution, Spidops is clearly meant to be a slow-acting Pokemon that can take a hit or two. While 92 and 86 aren't exactly terrible, they're not great either, especially with only 60 base HP. To help it out, I'd give it 10 more HP, 10 more physical attack, 20 more physical defense, and 6 more special defense. A 46 stat buff is big, but it's now equal in stats to Low-Kicks, the other early game Gen 9 bug. Now for moves, while its coverage is surprisingly good, there's a few things it could get that fit the theme of it being a secret agent and trapper. The fact that it takes out prey before it notices makes giving First Impression, Fake Out, and Sucker Punch as level up moves instead obvious choices that help out its poor speed. Seeing that many of Spidops' attacks deal with striking or draining, I think Drain Punch would be a neat fighting type option. And finally, if you want to play a bit more defensively, Counter and Mirror Coat serve as a neat reference to its bulletproof vest design. The biggest change I want to make though is to its abilities. Insomnia is kind of unfitting. I'd instead replace it with Prankster if you want to use it for status moves, since Spidops uses Trickery to mess with its opponents. My second change would be to make Stakeout a regular ability and instead make its hidden ability Arena Trap. This makes perfect sense since its entire behavior is centered around trapping its prey, although it probably can only do that to terrestrial Pokemon. Sure, they're drastic changes, but for a Pokemon that borders on being Kricketune bad, drastic is exactly what you need. And that's it. All 9 generations of Pokemon. Throughout this journey, I've explored the good Pokemon and the bad Pokemon. I've gotta say, it was a lot of fun going back to Venture through every game. As time goes on, I've grown a new level of respect for Pokemon. It's a game that stuck with me throughout my life. It's something that resonates with me. Maybe it's the diverse world and mesmerizing fantasy that attracts me, or the simple, sometimes repetitive, but always infectious gameplay. Or maybe it's the good and the bad of it all. Just like in real life, it's all about venturing forward and growing. Where will the path take you? I don't know. Will these Pokemon eventually get the love they deserve? I also don't know. But for both instances, I'm positive that good changes are on the way, and things will be just fine.